Okay, hi Ian. It's Jelena, and the topic that I've chosen for my disability sport presentation is wheelchair basketball. So, super exciting, super interesting to learn about actually. So, I should probably get into it because I'm a bit of a talker once I get going. Okay, so before I jump into membership patterns and growth and that sort of thing, I did just want to preface with the fact that there's not a ton of concrete evidence and research when it comes to hard numbers in the growth and membership of wheelchair basketball, especially on the kind of that local, smaller level. There's a little bit more when it comes to international and national growth and participation, but not so much on that smaller scale. But a pattern that I did notice in my research and kind of just my browsing was that the general growth of wheelchair basketball is exponential. Um, Participation and viewership is increasing. There's more media coverage. There's more awareness of adaptive sport, especially and globally it's growing because of the opportunities that it offers for inclusivity. Um, yeah, it's fun to watch. It's fun to be a part of. It's fast paced and it's a little bit different than what people are traditionally used to. So it's new and it's exciting. Yeah. Okay, so jumping into some of those membership trends and patterns and all that good stuff, starting at the local level. Here in Lethbridge, the Lethbridge Wheelchair Basketball Association provides opportunities for individuals and participants to play at both a competitive level or more of a recreational nature, whatever they so choose and feel most comfortable with. They offer weekly drop ins once a week where chairs are provided so that individuals can kind of go and be exposed to wheelchair basketball in a relatively relaxed and comfortable environment. Sometimes there's games, so you get a little bit more of that competitive edge, but you can also play recreationally if you so choose. As well as the Lethbridge Steamers are our local wheelchair basketball team that represent Lethbridge at a provincial level as well. So they kind of demonstrate the more competitive aspect of what we have to offer here locally. And then at a provincial level, we have Wheelchair Sports Alberta, which is a nonprofit organization who puts on, they're awesome. They put on a number of different events, developmental events, outreach events, tournaments, host a number of different teams that allow a really great number of individuals across Alberta to be exposed to wheelchair basketball, and there's plenty of opportunity. The Alberta Northern Lights Wheelchair Basketball Society is really cool. I had a really good time looking through their program and what they do. But essentially, it's a cost of anywhere around like approximately like $600 to $800, I believe, and you can rent chairs from them, and they will come into your school or organization and go through a thorough and detailed explanation of the adaptive sport, its why, how to do it, let kids and adults, I guess, practice and kind of play around and be creative with it essentially. And then, of course, on our national level, we have our Wheelchair Basketball Canada, who hosts a number of different events and or has teams who participate on a national level as well. They have been running a ton of targeted outreach programs and recruitment programs to kind of increase the exposure and participation in wheelchair basketball. So, as you can see here, I do have a stat that just says growth and participation is expected to increase by 20% by 2028, which is a super cool thing to think about as well. But yeah, and same thing here. Another hard statistic that I did find at a national level is that there's over 2,500 members in relation to wheelchair basketball from province to province, which is a super cool statistic considering that I didn't know much myself and hadn't really been exposed to it. So the fact that there's that many people provincially is super awesome. Okay, so I gotta get a move on here. For the sake of time, but at an international level, membership is just continuing to increase, and there's over 100,000 participants competing at various levels worldwide. Wheelchair basketball has a broad geographic reach and a large pair sport is a large parasport globally. So the International Wheelchair Basketball Federation is the national governing body there for us as well. And basketball, or wheelchair basketball, is probably one of the most popular adaptive sports that we see today. They do host competitions at the international level, those being the World Championships for both men and women. And there's also, it's not listed on the slide here, but there is a Junior World Championships as well for both men and women as well. And then the Paralympics are kind of the pinnacle, the big major event for a lot of para-athletes. They occur every 4 years and are preceded by qualification tournaments and events, which are, they're broken into 4 zones. So the top teams from those 4 zones will get to compete there. Okay, and not to spend too much time on this slide here, just because I had briefly touched on this in previous slides a little bit, but in terms of organization, I'll talk about governing bodies and their levels and all that good stuff here. So at an international level, we have the International Wheelchair Basketball Federation, which is obviously our international governing body. At a national level, we have the Wheelchair Basketball Canada, which I will talk about throughout this presentation plenty. And again, they offer various types of programming from the grassroots level, so we're talking about that targeted recruitment and exposure, all the way up to high-level athletes who compete at the Paralympic Games on behalf of Canada, which is super cool. And then at the provincial level, we have the Wheelchair Sports Alberta, which is our governing body, and then in Lethbridge here, we have our Lethbridge Wheelchair Basketball Association. Okay, so getting into the rules of play for wheelchair basketball, the rules are consistent with the rules set forth by the International Wheelchair Basketball Federation, which are also based off of the rules of the International Basketball Federation. These rules here are based off of able-bodied or standing basketball. That International Wheelchair Basketball Federation has just made some adaptations for a wheelchair. Structure is similar, rules are the same. It's 5-on-5 with 7 subs, 4 10-minute quarters with a 24-second shot clock. Scoring is the same, so from the free throw line, the 3-point line, and all of the above. Standard hoop height, court size as well. A couple of the differences are that there is no double dribble in wheelchair basketball. And that the wheelchair is considered to be part of an individual's body during play. So when it comes to contact and responsibility for contact, the wheelchair is technically part of that individual as well. It has its own set of fouls that account for wheelchairs as well too, which I'll go into a little bit later as well. And then players cannot lift out of or use leverage from their legs or push off of the floor with their feet or legs to gain an advantage in wheelchair basketball as well. It has to all come from that momentum from your arms. But other than that, the technical structure of the game is similar to standing or able-bodied basketball. A large part of the attraction and gain in popularity for wheelchair basketball as an adaptive sport is the lack of required equipment to actually adapt the sport itself. So in wheelchair basketball, some equipment that you'll see is obviously the sport wheelchair. These have been adapted to be streamlined, efficient, and they also have like a bumper on the front, which just prevents flipping, obviously for safety concerns. And then the spokes on the wheels are actually not steel, they're actually cable instead, so that they're a little bit more efficient and less heavy. And then obviously a basketball is required. Moulton is the official basketball of all major basketball competitions in Canada. And then standard, everything else is pretty standard. So like hoop height, court size, and dimensions and all that good stuff, which I already had touched on in a previous slide here. Okay, so when it comes to wheelchair basketball and the strategies, they are quite similar to those of a traditional standing basketball game, just because the main concepts of the game are the same. However, there are a few strategies that are worth recognizing. So in wheelchair basketball, the game is obviously a lot more anticipatory rather than reactive. in a traditional basketball game. It requires a lot more anticipation, planning, strategy, and execution and communication from team members, and predetermined sets and plays play a really large role in the success of a team when it comes to wheelchair basketball. Obviously, there's still the same tactics like zone to zone defense, man to man defense, and all that good stuff. But when it comes to offense and defense in wheelchair basketball, the positioning of the chair does a lot of the work. So, for example, say like boxing someone out or rebounding, usually it has to do with timing of the jump and the vertical, whereas in wheelchair basketball, it's the positioning of the chair and where you're anticipating that the other player is going to be so that you can avoid them reaching that rebound. The main difference between the games is obviously the strategy focuses on skillful maneuvering, and positioning of the sport wheelchair. So where you're going, where the other team is coming from. And again, you're not playing in that reactive manner that you would if you were running in a traditional basketball game. It is all based on a predetermined plan for the most part. And then athletes' visual range is lower, so we are lower when we're seated. So hand signals and those predetermined plays are obviously extremely important, as I had mentioned before, and are crucial to strategy when it comes to wheelchair basketball. And I super quickly wanted to add that I had forgot to mention in the previous slide, just something to recognize is the importance of transitioning in wheelchair basketball and how difficult it can actually be to move back and forth and up and down the court. And then once spatial and spacing has kind of been lost, how difficult it can be to recover just because of the amount of upper body energy expenditure that is required to properly execute those skills in game. They're used sparingly and really strategically in comparison to a basketball game, a standing basketball game when you're constantly running back and forth on that court there. But anyways, moving into the origin of the sport here, like many parasports, they originated in the origins of World War II, when lots of war veterans were coming home and were then physically disabled and were in rehabilitation centers and were looking for, still had a strong desire to play sport. We're looking to be part of something and participate in something larger. So the philosophy of the time was that adaptation of particular sports as viewed through the eyes of rehabilitation staff. So this meant that they were looking for the easiest way, or the rehabilitation staff was looking for the easiest sports to adapt that would provide the most benefit to these war veterans who were struggling and wanted to play. So basketball was perceived at the time to be one of the easiest sports to adapt, like I had mentioned earlier in terms of equipment. So the first documented game was played by a group of veterans in the United States in 1946, and then the Canadian Wheelchair Basketball League was introduced in 1986, and it has continued to grow since then. With its roots and origins in post-World War II, wheelchair basketball has continued to evolve, adapt, and modernize itself into a version that is so closely related to the structure of the traditional standing basketball game. Rules have evolved from simple adaptations with a chair to an advanced international standard that has been set forth by the International Wheelchair Basketball Federation, which are followed worldwide. The chair itself has adapted from a standard stainless steel wheelchair into something that has been more sport specific, has had safety adaptations to ensure the safety of the players during play, as well as more streamlined and efficient and more game specific to the game. There's been a couple rule changes as well to wheelchair basketball. So one of the most significant is the 2-push rule. This is a travel rule, just indicating that the player has 2 pushes with their wheelchair before they need to move the ball. A third push would indicate a travel and would be called as a penalty. Another significant adaptation would be the classification system. This is a method that is used to ensure fairness and that the functional potential of one team doesn't outweigh the other. So The point system ranks each individual player based on their physical ability. And based on that classification, there can be up to 14 points throughout the 5 players that are on the court. And it's up to the coach's discretion to determine who goes on the court based on their strategy and the outcome that they would like to see on the court. Recently, gender-specific language has been removed from the official wheelchair basketball rules to encourage and foster an inclusive environment. Pretty self-explanatory there, as well as the rulebook has recently been simplified, so any contacts previously categorized under the throw-in, foul definition, and the penalties associated with that are now categorized under the unsportsmanlike or personal foul category, just to simplify things for officials and players as well. And a significant branch in wheelchair basketball that has come to light in recent years is 3-on-3 wheelchair basketball in comparison to the traditional 5-on-5. This is just a little bit more fast-paced and requires a little bit more skill and execution, and gives an opportunity for those players to experience a little bit more growth if they've already been playing traditional 5-on-5, and to showcase their skills a little bit better. Okay, so briefly moving through this slide, just because I did touch on some of this information in my membership slide there. But for local competition, we do see the Lethbridge Wheelchair Basketball Association hosting weekly drop-in sessions at the Fritzik Senior Center here in Lethbridge. That includes friendly scrimmages and recreational play. Again, chairs are provided. Players from surrounding areas often come into Lethbridge to participate, so from around Tabor, Cardston, Stirling area, so we get a lot of outreach that way. The Lethbridge Steamers are also part of representing Lethbridge in the Wheelchair Sports Alberta League circuit as well. And on a provincial level, we see the Wheelchair Sports Alberta hosting tournaments and provincial league plays. There's many inter-city tournaments and provincial championships and the Junior West Championships that are hosted at a provincial level. Inter-city tournaments can include areas like Calgary, Red Deer, Lethbridge, some of those major centers that do have a team to put forth, as well as the Wheelchair Sports Alberta also facilitates the developmental events and community outreach tournaments. So this can be like school programming and opportunities for individuals in the community to learn and participate in wheelchair basketball. And at an international level, there are multiple major competitions, obviously, for wheelchair basketball. So some that we've already touched on. The Paralympic Games, again, are kind of like that pinnacle for para-athletes. So held every 4 years, and once again, they qualify through zonal winning. The International Wheelchair Basketball Federation World Championships, again, held every 4 years, mid-between Paralympic cycles. And then again, the zonal championships, divided into those 4 zones there, act as qualifiers for the World Championships and Paralympics, so they precede those events there. And then, of course, the Junior World Championships for both men and women. And once again, moving through the slide relatively quickly, eligibility and classification for wheelchair basketball. So in Canada, you do not need a disability to participate domestically in wheelchair basketball. It is for everybody anybody of any ability is able to participate. However, if you want to represent Canada at an international level and compete at international competitions, you do need to have some sort of physical eligibility to be considered for competition. And when it comes to classification, I know that we had already kind of touched on this, but in wheelchair basketball, classification is the process of a functional evaluation that considers a player's individual ability to perform sport-specific skills in wheelchair basketball, so their functionality on the court in relation to the skills that are important to wheelchair basketball there. So they are assigned a point value based on the skill assessment that determines their classification from 1 to 4.5. The greater the number, the greater the functional movement of the player in the chair, so balance, trunk movement. And then this is combined amongst the players on the court for a total point score of 14. And then once again, this is done to level the functional potential of the team in respect to its opposition. So just ensuring fair play for all teams involved. Okay, so for the purpose of this assignment, I have actually chosen to incorporate wheelchair basketball into an inclusive school or classroom setting or physical education classroom setting. There's already some programs in place. So, Wheelchair Basketball Canada actually facilitates a program that is specifically designed to educate both students and staff on wheelchair basketball and encourages them to be physically active regardless of their physical ability. So, they will actually send a facilitator to the school with wheelchairs to explain the game, answer questions, run drills, teach skills, and even incorporate some gameplay. So that's a really great option for inclusivity that's already been established here in Canada. For my personal recommendations here, I would provide firstly an explanation of wheelchair basketball and why it is meant for everybody and can be played by everybody regardless of physical ability under the same rules there. And then when describing the chair, I would prefer to describe the chair as a form of sporting equipment rather than a symbol of the disability portion of the game, treating it as its own adaptive sport rather than something that's completely different, and just having that conversation. I would also love to have an individual there who is experienced or established in wheelchair basketball, just so that they can provide an authentic insight into the game and perspective and kind of develop that emotional portion of understanding for staff and students as well. So, if a wheelchair is available when introducing this into a classroom setting, I would familiarize the students with the equipment. So, explain the wheelchair, what makes it sport specific, and have someone either who's established or familiar with wheelchair basketball demonstrate, or do have someone do their best to do so, someone who is educated. And then allow participants to practice and try and explore, gain curiosity and comfortability through practice and trying. But if a chair is not available, I would modify and use everyday objects that mimic the core challenges of being seated while playing. So if there's like those PE scooters, which I tried to find a photo of but could not to put in here, unfortunately. But to mimic that, what it feels like to play sitting down, or sitting or kneeling, which doesn't essentially necessarily have the same effect, but it does help us understand the communication, the anticipation, and those struggles there with slowed movement, and that kind of perspective of wheelchair basketball. So you don't need a wheelchair for it to be inclusive, but it is definitely ideal. Once again, I'm so sorry that this was so long. I'm just such a yapper. But these are my references here as well. I don't know.